Meta is expanding the surveillance state, and Mark Zuckerberg really is a terrible human being. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic, and let's dive in. Now, this week, we're obviously going to be talking about Meta, and first, I want to basically give you a quick primer from Joe Wilkins of Futurism, because if you didn't know, according to new reporting by the New York Times, Meta could make their facial recognition features available to smart glasses owners as early as this year. You may know somebody that is using Meta glasses. I believe they're made by Ray-Ban, and they have cameras in them. And now they're introducing facial recognition. Now, internally, the software goes by the designation known as a name tag. Per NYT sources, basically, it would let anybody who owns Meta smart glasses to identify people in the real world, instantly pulling up their information through AI's Meta Assistant. So you're walking through town and you see that cute girl or boy or whatever, and you point your glasses towards them, it'll hit them with facial recognition, and then Meta's AI assistant will tell you, oh, that's Bob, that's Sally, that's whoever. Now, since early 2025, the New York Times noted that Meta insiders have been essentially hemming and hawing over how to roll out this feature, acknowledging basically its significant, quote, safety and privacy risks, end quote, that are essentially associated with this feature. In other words, they know the problems, and we're going to go through the problems here with this, but they are very, very much aware. Documents reviewed by the New York Times reportedly show that the company was planning to wash its product through a launch to the disabled community, which quite frankly, I think using the disabled community as a cover is disgusting. So it never came to pass, though it evidently would have involved introducing name tag as an accessibility feature at a conference for blind users before unleashing it on the public. So in other words, this will help the blind because it can identify the person or thing or object in front of the blind person, therefore giving them an assistance. I think that's an excellent idea. Not from this company. Now, the same documents likewise argued that basically domestic political turmoil across the United States in May of 2025. Remember, this is the early days of the ICE deportation campaigns. Doge was still running through the government, all that kind of stuff. So that backdrop would have made an appealing time window for the release of such a controversial feature because the public would be too burned out or to basically notice or even care. In other words, Meta knew basically that this would have some kind of backlash, but if they did it at a time where everybody was distracted because, ICE is tear gassing a neighborhood or whatever, then they could simply get away with this. This is how terrible these people are. Now, the memo read, per the New York Times, quote, "We will launch during a dynamic political environment where many civil society groups that we would expect to attack us would have their resources focused on other concerns." So thanks, Joe Wilkins of Futurism, for that quick primer, but I'd like to talk about the dangers to society here as a result of this privacy-destroying move. Meta has an absolute history of violating our privacy over and over and over and over, and this move just adds to their litany of sins, which we will get to here. So let's discuss first and foremost why this is a bad idea. And I've got 7 points for you as I was just writing all of this down as I've been thinking about this all day. First and most obvious, right, is that essentially the person being identified is simply a non-user or a bystander who didn't opt in. We didn't get a prompt, right? So we may never know this actually happened. If I walk by a person that says, hey, I think I know that guy, and he or she taps the glasses and it takes my face and then gives them basically an understanding of who I am, that's what we're talking about here. Smart glasses remove that social friction that exists when somebody pulls out a phone to record. If somebody pulls out a phone in front of me and starts recording, why? I have the ability to understand that they're doing that and confront that. We've seen that with all of these ICE things. I'm not getting political, but people with cell phones out there, they're obviously recording, for posterity, for the record, for whatever it is. But if it's glasses, I may simply not know. And the opt-in for the wearer, basically, because the wearer who's wearing it is opting themselves in, is not consent for everybody else that those cameras are going to view, especially when you're looking at areas or contexts that are essentially semi-private. Think like a school, a hospital, a clinic, I don't know, maybe an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, workplaces, all these kinds of things. If you're surreptitiously being recorded or recognized, that's a problem. And my second point is that this really underscores that the concept known as surveillance at scale is basically something that we should all absolutely abhor. If identification is like fast and cheap because boom, you're just hitting it with these glasses, you don't need state infrastructure. And the state doesn't necessarily need state infrastructure. You essentially create a distributed surveillance apparatus. Thousands to millions of wearers basically become roving sensors around the globe. We've seen this with Ring doorbells, but those are stationary on everybody's homes. But if I'm walking, through downtown Chicago or New York or LA or Toronto or wherever I am, now I basically become a tool essentially of the state because I can record, I can see things, or maybe Meta can simply turn on the glasses for me because they know I'm in a geographical location because they're tracking my location through my phone. These are things that we have to consider. Historically, this is a classic surveillance state expansion pattern. It really is, because capabilities start as a consumer convenience and then they migrate into institutional standards, such as integrations into like security companies, employers start adopting these, even bounty hunter types and law enforcement, right? And basically what that means is that the demand basically for the footage of these, that from these glasses, via warrants or subpoenas or all of that are going to explode. But we also can't assume that Meta will protect our privacy. Zuckerberg has spent a ton of time cozying up to the current administration, so he may simply give them the footage without any kind of privacy protection or anything else. This is not like the situation with Apple where they built encryption in the iPhone and then refused to crack it. Meta has always basically sold things to the highest bidder. Why should this be any different? Right? Now, my third point is that even if this is pitched as accessibility or safety, as Meta was trying to position this, the same product pipeline supports basically things like profiling, ad targeting, identity resolution. These are the kinds of things that I'm deeply concerned about. Once products like these exist, essentially Meta's incentive is to expand use cases and then integrate all the different types of data sets they have on us, and therefore try to increase both the retention and the value of the biometric information that they are holding on to us. Remember, they've been in trouble for basically their facial recognition of us just simply taking pictures with phones and uploading it to Facebook, Instagram, etc. Now it gets even worse. And so my fourth issue here is on the biometric side. Think about it this way. Faces are persistent identifiers, right? You can change a password, but you can't really change your face. And not all of us are going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on facial recognition software. And we're also not going to be painting our faces constantly just as we're walking through public to try to avoid these things. Most of us are simply not going to be doing those things. Our faces are intrinsically ours. Therefore, a breach or a misuse of our face creates long-term harm, right? We're talking about things like stalking. If you see somebody and you happen to be the stalker type and you're like, oh, she's really beautiful or he's really hot or whatever. And, all of that, not to mention doxing, identity correlation across multiple platforms, which is something governments are really good at. That's a huge problem. And then there are the free speech, and association issues here, which is my fifth point. People behave differently when they believe they can be identified in public. That is especially harmful for things like journalists who are trying to keep a low profile as they are gathering information on, let's say, whoever they are to write articles, not to mention activists. We've seen that in Minneapolis and other places, whistleblowers, vulnerable communities. All of these things have a huge susceptibility problem, right? And this also undermines the open society norms that we're supposed to have, because the capability of these glasses fundamentally changes what people think or perceive as simply being safe. Right? Because if now we know that glasses are everywhere and I'm a glasses wearer, these things never leave my face, except when I sleep. Now I'm walking down the street and people suspect me automatically, possibly of recording them. These are the kinds of things that there's a huge issue with, right? And then there's the misidentification issues that we've seen through the years via relying on this type of technology. And so my sixth point is simply facial recognition still produces false matches. That error can be insanely severe, right? We've seen harassment. We've just seen denial of service to people that have been misidentified, wrongful suspicion. In other words, you look like somebody that did rob the bank, but you didn't rob the bank, and if these systems basically start using the closest match type result standard, meaning, well, we're not 100% sure, but it's very close to this person, or it starts suggesting identities from public profiles, there could be wrong inferences here that could actually create real world confrontations. We've seen false accusations and even arrests as a result of being misidentified. One person spent something like a year in prison or in jail simply because the AI said, yeah, this is the guy that did the crime, and the cops believed the AI, where this guy was like, I wasn't even in the state. These are huge things. And finally, this is my last point here, is that this type of technology is ripe for abuse, and it's incredibly hard to police. Stalking, domestic violence, hey, Meta glasses or whatever, identify that woman on the train kind of thing. Not to mention, this could lead to political intimidation, targeted harassment. All of these things become features. We have seen numerous judges basically get death threats now, as a result of simply doing their jobs. We're in an era that is susceptible to political violence, and this isn't helping. And the enforcement side of this is incredibly different. We'd be relying on after-the-fact reporting rather than being able to actually prevent the harm that is happening, right? And again, if I'm pulling out my camera to film somebody, they're going to see it. And the glasses, they cannot. And I've seen videos where people will say, oh, well, there's a light on the glasses, and then another video on here's how you disable the light. So that's a huge issue. So this is a bad idea in general. But with Meta running this actual technology, it's a walking human rights violation. Their track record is horrific. And while I won't go through all of their sins, I've done other segments on that. You can go to my YouTube channel and look up It's Time to Put Mark Zuckerberg in Jail. I've done 2 versions of it. The last one was an hour long of just their litany of sins. I do want to focus here briefly on why they, as a corporation, should never, ever be allowed to own technology. And quite frankly, they should be shut down. But if you recall, in 2019, the FTC, or Federal Trade Commission, imposed a $5 billion penalty and mandated sweeping privacy governance changes after violations by Meta of a prior FTC order. And remember, $5 billion to a company that's valued around $1 trillion, it's Mark Zuckerberg rooting around his couch cushions for spare change. Right? On top of it, there have been prior facial recognition backlashes and rollbacks, with Meta products. Meta, then Facebook, shut down its facial recognition system for tagging and said it would delete facial recognition templates that it had because basically lawsuits and regulators began sniffing around and investigating its use. On top of it, the state of Illinois has BIPA, the Biometric Information Privacy Act, basically litigated Facebook. They reached a $650 million settlement over their face template practices. They were not giving Illinoisans, and I'm literally sitting, in Chicago, Illinois right now. They didn't give us the ability to opt in, to give our consent. They simply did it. This is exactly the regulatory domain that consumer facial recognition triggers. And so these glasses are going to be walking rights violations up and down. The state of Illinois, which I believe was the first to have a Biometric Information Privacy Act, and I believe other states have followed suit. On top of it, there's ongoing privacy litigation thanks to Cambridge Analytica. Mark Zuckerberg literally went in front of Congress and lied about that. Meta has continued to face major claims and settlements tied to its misuse and oversharing of user data. And remember, they were running psychological profiles for political campaigns. Basically, Cambridge Analytica was using the data that they were getting from Facebook. They ran Ted Cruz, senator from Texas's. They were doing it for Ted Cruz. Steve Bannon, who is an associate of President Trump, were all using this. This is a huge issue. But I think it's rather clear that there's a through line here. And the through line is basically simply this. Meta, aka Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, etc., repeatedly ships engagement and growth-driven features first, and then, only then, negotiates privacy constraints after regulators, courts, and essentially civil society simply intervenes or discovers this in some way, shape, or form. In other words, they're not asking for permission, they're asking for forgiveness with these things, and it should be the absolute opposite when it comes to our human rights. This is a huge issue. And so the bottom line is simply this. This move by Meta normalizes the idea that identifying strangers on site, on demand, is essentially a standard consumer capability. And we should be using that. A standard which lowers the political and cultural barrier to broader biometric surveillance. Whether it's private actors, employers, or the state, this is something that we should not take lying down. And my thought would be, if I see somebody with Meta glasses, I would want to get confrontational with them. The other side of it is I would want to avoid them. I'm not interested in hanging out with people that could potentially record me when I'm trying to have a private conversation. This ain't good. And quite frankly, it's something that we all need to be aware about. And at this point, if you're a Meta Glasses fan or a Facebook fan, you can't say you haven't been told. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And I do understand the irony of that, but I do put these out on Facebook intentionally to make sure that people on Facebook, a Meta product, know just how bad this company is. But I say that as to say, also follow me on YouTube as well, which, is no slouch at data mining us. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 I'm going to say private as best you can, informed and secure. Take care.